Welcome to Conversations with Frank Fabozzi. I'm Frank Fabozzi. This series is brought to you by the CFA Institute Research and Policy Center. My guest today is Lori Heinel. She's the Executive Vice President and Global Chief Investment Officer at State Street Global Advisors. Before she joined State Street, she held senior leadership roles at Oppenheimer Funds and Citigroup, where she was responsible for strategic investment decisions and advising large institutional portfolios. Laura received her MBA from Carnegie Mellon University and her bachelor's degree in religion from Princeton University, something I learned. I never realized Princeton had a major in religion. And she is a CFA Charterholder. Welcome, Lori.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, it's my pleasure. I realize you're very busy, and I appreciate your taking the time to for this interview. What led you to the role of CIO at State Street, and what do you like most about your role as CIO?
Yeah. Well, again, thank you so much for having me. As you can imagine, what led me here was a combination of luck and skill. So I had, many decades of experience in financial services, primarily in asset management. And about 10 years ago, almost to the day, I got tapped to join State Street Global Advisors in what was then a head of portfolio strategy role. And that really quickly evolved into a deputy CIO role, working under my predecessor, Rick Lakai. And he and I worked very closely together for the ensuing couple of years to really help prepare me to be a chief investment officer of such a large organization. But when I was first his deputy, I really handled a lot of the non-core investment capabilities, including a lot of our operations, client communication, reporting, sustainability, what was then called ESG. I would get tapped for a lot of strategic projects. So I think I've got a kind of perfect blend of investment-oriented experiences coupled with a lot of those kind of operator business experiences. And I would say for my current job, it suits me so well because it is the kind of position where you wake up every day and something's different. And we're kind of used to that in investing because markets evolve, markets are different every day. But really, the sort of backdrop in which we're operating also is evolving every day. So it's an incredibly challenging and great opportunity.
Yeah. Well, reflecting on your career as CIO, what achievement or milestone are you most proud of, and how has it impacted State Street?
Yeah, so there are so many, but I think rather than anchoring on a singular milestone, what I would say has been most gratifying and where I think I've had the greatest impact in the organizations that I've worked in is this kind of client-centric notion. And we often talk about how important client centricity is. But when you really take that to heart, the way I think about it is that we need to lead our clients. We need to understand deeply what they're trying to accomplish, what their challenges are, what their boundary conditions or parameters are, and then come with solutions because we're the experts. We're the ones who have seen the different scenarios and understand what the different decision points are and what options there are, et cetera. So I would say that throughout my career, I've applied that kind of lens to all manner of problems. So many, many years ago, when I was at SEI Investments, one of the things that I spearheaded there was our goals-based investing initiative. And that was an initiative which sought to turn asset allocation on its ear and basically made the assertion that, kind of conventional risk-reward was not the only way to think about an investment problem, that you needed to think about liabilities, that you needed to think about income, that you needed to think about drawdown risk. And that was sort of in the early days of this kind of outcome-driven investing kind of concept. So I'm quite proud that we were innovators there, including developing liability-driven investing kinds of schemas. And then sort of fast forward, when I was at Citi, one of the things that we really looked at was this idea of total wealth management. Not just what could you do for investment performance, but how did tax planning and other kinds of, even things like asset location strategies, how did those come into the mix? And so again, I think we were at the forefront, and I feel quite proud to have been spearheading that. when I was at Citi. And then I would say, if I look at my role today, one of the things that's been maybe a hallmark of the last several years is this really focus on solutions for clients. And if you think about the retirement income conundrum, right, it's not just about a glide path and accumulation strategy, but it's also a decumulation strategy. And how do you do that more effectively for clients? Certainly, liability-driven investing has kind of come to the mainstream. We've had clients who want to integrate other sensibilities, and I know we're going to talk about this a little later in the podcast, but sustainability, ESG parameters. So I guess I'm kind of deflecting on the question here, but the main thread is this idea of really thinking about the problem in a much more detailed and nuanced way, because that gets you to a better outcome for the clients.
Okay, well, you've answered part of my next question. How would you describe your investment philosophy?
Yeah.
And how does it guide your strategic decision?
Yeah, no, I thought a lot about this because, as you note, each client journey is a little bit idiosyncratic, right? And so we need to be able to accommodate them with what they need to do. But I do think that fundamentally it is about creating compelling, durable investment propositions that actually help those clients achieve their goals. And that can manifest in lots of ways. I mean, certainly here at State Street Global Advisors, we have the full toolkit of index-oriented strategies. So virtually any exposure that you want, equities, fixed income, other, in whatever granular form or kind of large box form you want, that's a tool that we can bring to a client's disposal. So that's the easy one, right? That's compelling, it's durable, it's cost-effective, it's got all the sort of necessary ingredients. What becomes more interesting is that you say, well, what are the step outs? So where do you want to go active? And in our particular scenario, we have certain active capabilities that we think are quite compelling. And so making sure that we have, rigor around what active propositions we want to offer. I think one of the things where we've also differentiated ourselves over the years is in this kind of solutions mindset and the solutions product. So I, mentioned earlier things like retirement income or, target date portfolios that are useful in defined contribution schemes. But this concept of putting together a bunch of pieces to get a solution that's packaged up, think model portfolios, things of that nature. We want to have our full complement of those because those are really important tools to use for investors. And then, when I think about alternatives, that's probably the place where we have the least footprint today, but we've forged a number of really important partnerships with other organizations to be able to bring some of those tools to bear where we don't necessarily have the capacity, at least not today, to manufacture them ourselves. So I think as CIO, the guiding principle is compelling, durable propositions that solve problems. And then, in our case, there are a lot of those boxes that we can tick ourselves, but then also partnering with other organizations to be able to tick the other boxes.
Or how do you approach portfolio construction in today's macroeconomic uncertainty and market volatility environment? And what strategies are critical to maintaining long-term resilience?
Yeah. No, that's a great question. And, I was schooled in classic methodologies, right? Mean variance optimization. And, the portfolio risk was really a function of the allocation to risk assets like equities and fixed income and cash, et cetera. So I do think that those principles remain and they're important to keep in mind. But the world has changed and we have so many different tools at our disposal, perhaps most importantly, to understand risk. So it's always a bit of an exercise to figure out if you're actually going to get return, right? The market is going to give and the market's going to take away. And, in different environments, you can have more confidence around your return expectation for certain assets. But, you can't be 100% confident because things happen. But on the risk side, those relationships tend to be more durable and they tend to be things that you can anchor more of your modeling on. So I guess the first principle I would say beyond the kind of classic ones is to really think through what risks do you want to manage, right? And again, going back to my earlier comments, it's not just about managing volatility risk, although that's an important one, and that's one that many clients anchor on and many practitioners anchor on. But increasingly, I think the industry is coming to terms with other risks in some cases are even more important. So you think about, again, a pension plan environment, shortfall risk, it's real. It's something that companies have to contend with. If you think about an individual, longevity risk, it's real, right? When you think about running out of money when you're, well into your advanced years and having to have that kind of situation. If you think about income or the loss of income on a portfolio. So I guess the point I would make is that portfolio construction today needs to still, be anchored in some of those classical theories, but it needs to evolve to take account of these other kinds of risks in the portfolio. And there are lots of tools that you can use to manage those things. You can use option strategies, right? That's a simple one we've been using for decades, and they've become more ubiquitous across the industry. And that can help you manage tail risks. You can use insurance. Insurance can be a great thing that helps with longevity risk. You can use more stylized kinds of exposures. So instead of doing, large, aggregate indices and fixed income, you could sort of tailor that and use more TIPS or Treasury inflation protected securities rather than kind of a big box fixed income allocation if you're worried about inflation risk, right? So again, to me, that's an important theme that as practitioners, we have an incredible ability to leverage very precise tools and exposures in very risk-aware ways. And if we deploy that with that kind of client mindset at hand, I think we can come up with some really clever solutions.
Well, how do you assess the risks and opportunities in alternative asset classes such as private equity, private debt, real estate? And how do these investments fit within the your broader asset allocation framework?
Sure. Look, I think investors want to take advantage of all the opportunities that are out there. And certainly private real estate, private credit, private equity, hedge funds, you name it. These asset classes can bring different perspectives or different exposures to the portfolio. But again, I think the thing that we've learned over the last couple of decades now, so this is not new news, but I think it's increasingly better understood, is that these instruments are often driven by the same kinds of factors that public market instruments are driven by. So for example, we've done a lot of research and many others have done research as well, that when you normalize private equity for illiquidity and for the leverage that's inherent in the private equity asset class, you actually don't do much better in private equity than you do in public equity. Now, you have a different risk profile from a perception standpoint, right? These assets aren't marked to market daily the way that public equity is. So you have to, do some manipulation, if you will, within the portfolio to normalize the risk profiles and do the hard work to say, okay, where does that fit? So it doesn't mean that it doesn't fit, but it means that you need to look at it through the lens of what are you really getting when you sign up for that kind of exposure. Are you getting, incremental return just from the asset class? And we would argue not very much, certainly not in this day and age. But can you get alpha? Sure, there are plenty of good private equity sponsors out there that can drive pretty good alpha. So if you can select strong private equity managers, like why not? That would be a fantastic thing to do in the portfolio. And same thing with hedge funds. Like, when we were all sort of growing up with hedge funds decades ago, they seemed like magic, right? These were things that seemed to deliver, equity-like returns without a lot of risk or without the same drawdown. And yet what we found out, repeatedly through market crises was, oh my gosh, they actually did have equity beta risk. Who knew? And so again, I think understanding what the return drivers are of any exposure that you're going to put into the portfolio is critically important. And then you can take advantage of it because you know where you're going to take the allocation from, how large you're going to size the position, what that's going to do from a total portfolio diversification standpoint, and what's the return complement that you're getting from that exposure.
Well, geopolitical events have an increasing influence on financial markets. How do you factor geopolitical risks into your investment decision-making process? And what analytical tools or frameworks do you use to assess the potential impact?
Yeah. So when I was reading this question, when you gave me sort of advance warning, this is the one that I felt was the toughest to actually respond to. But as I thought about it, I think there are a couple of dimensions to this question. So I guess the first answer is it's really hard to invest in anticipation of or on the back of geopolitical events. And what we find time and time again, and I can show you all sorts of charts, I'm sure you have a lot of them yourself, is that you often have an immediacy to market reaction, but oftentimes very quickly on the heels of that, things either mean revert or they go in sort of random walks. And so being able to develop an investment strategy that's poised to take advantage of or to protect from massive geopolitical risk is really, really hard. So for the most part, we don't do that, right? We don't worry about that in that way. But I do think there are places where it does matter. So one dimension that we have seen persistently is that in periods where risk seems low, there's probably something lurking under the surface. So I would put geopolitical risk into that context. So having a certain amount of protection in your portfolio, whether that's diversifiers or whether that's cash or whether that's some other type of a hedging strategy, is probably always a good thing because that will zig when the rest of the world zags. And so that's one thing that we've done here. I think the second thing is to think through the different scenarios and try to, scenario test, like what is the most likely outcome. And in that environment, you're just doing good analysis. You're saying, okay, this happened. So when, we had the horrific invasion of Ukraine and you said, well, geez, the obvious transmission mechanism there is it's probably going to put, Europe in a tough spot from a growth standpoint. But the other sort of obvious one was that it was going to lead energy prices to go up because you're going to have greater demand from Europe because they had been sort of on this greening trajectory. You're going to have supply disruption, but trying to figure out how those two things balance off of one another in terms of trying to predict something like oil prices, it was not trivial. And so playing through some different scenarios, like how sharp a slowdown might you get? How long might this be from a duration standpoint? Where is incremental supply? Where is, incremental demand? So that's, I think, another thing that we try often to do when these geopolitical events transpire. And then the third one, which is probably the toughest, but if you can get it right, it actually has really good payoff, is what is happening structurally. Is there something as a consequence of this geopolitical event that will manifest in kind of structural change that's more enduring? And I don't have a good geopolitical example in the moment, but one that's sort of geopolitical that we've been thinking about a lot is debt sustainability, particularly government debt sustainability, and particularly U.S. government debt sustainability. And our basic idea there is not that it's necessarily unsustainable. I mean, the U.S. is a large country. We've got lots of resources. There are lots of ways to pay for our debt. But what it might mean in terms of policy choices and how that might manifest in opportunities from an investment standpoint. So that's maybe a little bit more than you wanted, but that's a little bit of into thinking about how we do this on a daily basis.
I like the classification and the framework. Now I'm going to put you on the spot. A journal that I edit has a special issue called Novel Risks. Okay. And it'll be published, that issue, later in 2025. Now I'm going to put you on the spot. I want you to write this up. Extend it a little bit.
Yeah.
And, you got a wonderful group of researchers there.
Yeah.
Where you couldn't figure out something, they will. They're very good.
Yeah.
So we'll talk about that after the interview.
That would be a fantastic challenge for us to take you up on.
Okay, that's good. Now the next two questions. Before I ask them, I want you to tell me a little about your undergraduate degree at Princeton in religion.
Yeah.
And how one of the areas you specialize is in ESG.
Yeah.
Is anything where a degree in religion should come in and help you understand that would be in that area? Forget about G. I always think of E and S. G we always should have been concerned with.
Yeah.
Okay. But tell me a little bit about what a degree in religion from Princeton, because I'm sure they didn't have you do any mathematical equations of what's in the Bible.
Yeah.
Right? And the other thing that's impressive is you went from a program, Princeton is rigorous in every area, but I would imagine in religion you didn't see many mathematical equations or statistical analysis. Then you went to Carnegie Mellon, which I know is an extremely analytical program. Even in your application, you have to put in a couple of equations. So I find that interesting. So tell me about the program in religion and how it links in with your interest in ESG.
Yeah. So I could go on about this topic for longer than this podcast would tolerate. So I'll try to keep it short. But I guess the first thing I would say is that I always was kind of a math nut, right? So I was the kid who was always kind of top of my class in trigonometry and calculus, and I did take higher order math classes at Princeton, even while I majored in religion. So I guess the good and the bad news is I do have a natural kind of analytical brain, and so those concepts always came pretty easily to me. So that was fantastic. But I decided after my freshman year that I did not want to be an engineer because not only was it really hard, but you did have a life. You basically spent all your time at the comp sci building or, head down in a book. And I just decided that engineering was not for me. So then I had to decide what I did want to do. And the great thing about going to a school like Princeton or really any liberal arts college is that in some sense it doesn't matter because you're there to learn how to think. You're there to learn how to put together arguments. You're there to think critically. You're there to synthesize ideas. You're there to communicate. I could go on and on and on. And so just serendipitously, I took a class with Professor Elena Pagels, who wrote a book many years ago called The Gnostic Gospels, which I found fascinating. And I decided, why do I study that? That sounds really interesting, And the other fantastic thing was that at Princeton, the religious studies curriculum enabled me to take a lot of minor kind of activities. So in, things like comp literature or psychology or other things could count towards my degree requirements depending upon what the actual course was. So it gave me a fair amount of flexibility to indulge my passions about a lot of things while being, of course, very anchored on a particular curriculum. And it was very much a history and sociology of religion versus I wanted to be a minister or a priest or a practitioner. So what did it teach me? I think there were a couple things. I really do attribute a lot of my success through my entire career, but as you know, even in this sort of sustainability conversation, to a lot of things I learned during that course of study. I always found it fascinating, and I mean that in a lot of ways, what people will do in the name of religion, right? And we've lived with this for millennia, right? And we're living it today. And this idea that somebody could hold a truth so dear to themselves that nothing else mattered. And what it taught me is how important it is to be able to meet people a little bit where they live, right? To be able to have discourse in a way that was respectful and recognize differences in people didn't have to mean complete divergence or something worse. And I do find that, I'm often in situations where the emotions on a topic run incredibly high. And I can kind of go back to that touchstone in my training in religion to say, people can have different views on the world, on God, on life, on whatever, but they're still something human there. There's still something that we can hopefully find common ground on. So that to me has been an incredible gift, that it was a choice I made when I was very young, that I made for maybe all the wrong reasons at the time, other than just I thought it was fascinating. But it's ended up being one of the best things to prepare me for what I deal with on a daily basis.
Well, okay, given that, how do you integrate ESG considerations into your investment process and balance long-term sustainability goals with short-term financial performance?
Yeah. Yeah, no, this is obviously a topic we've spent a long time and a lot of energy thinking about and talking about. But I guess the first thing I would say is that State Street Global Advisors has been involved in sustainability, ESG, socially responsible investing, pick your moniker, for decades, literally. So going back to, the 20th century. We've had clients who wanted to invest in ways that aligned with their own sensibilities, whether that's faith-based kinds of strategies or things that eliminated tobacco, alcohol, firearms, things of that nature. So it's not a new concept in the State Street Global Advisors context. But the thing that we centered on many, many years ago was really two things. One is it's not our money, it's our clients' money. So the way that they want to invest matters, and we need to respect that. And then the second thing is that where there were choices or judgments that we made, we were operating in a fiduciary capacity, which means that we need to think about the value creation, not the values dimension of the problem. And every time I've had a tricky conversation, I've come back to those two touchstones. It's not our money, it's our clients' money. We do what they want us to do, what they direct us to do, what they feel is the right thing for them. And where we have choices, it's about value creation, not about values of any sort. So, like with that as backdrop, then the question really becomes, okay, so what does it mean to integrate ESG? And I think the main thing that it means is ESG is a risk just like so many other risks, right? We, for many years, have looked at corporate strategy risk. For many years, we've looked at, leadership risk in companies. These aren't things that are easily quantifiable, but we know that they're there. And we do a very good job, I think, of trying to suss those out and figure out when we need to make an active decision, which companies to invest in for the long haul. So if you think about ESG having kind of, at least three different risk dimensions, it becomes quite clear that you have to consider these things. So the first and the most obvious is the physical risk attached to ESG. So that's come to us very clearly in some of the extreme weather events that we've been having around the world. I mean, obviously recent ones here in the United States, but around the world literally for quite some time. So whether you believe in climate change or you don't believe in climate change is sort of irrelevant. The relevant factor is you need to understand the physical location, the supply chain, the potential for disruption, all of those things. And oh, by the way, now layer on things like insurance costs and other sort of knock-on effects that derive from that sort of physical risk set of criteria. And that's a thing. Like understanding what a company's kind of footprint looks like, that's important. And then you look at the sort of second dimension of it, which is technology and obsolescence. Again, whether you agree with climate change being a function of fossil fuels or not is sort of irrelevant. But what are the technologies that are emerging to either replace fossil fuels or to capture carbon or pick your favorite thing? Or even in other industries like cement production and other industries that are high polluting industries, there's technology that's happening. So companies that don't sort of forge a path forward to navigate that are going to be rendered obsolete. And then the third is what I would characterize as more of the consumer/regulatory, and they go hand in hand. And that is really about preferences and or drivers that are kind of exogenous, right? That either behavior patterns change or at more extreme levels, regulations change and you have to comply or you have to do things in response to that. So long-winded answer, I apologize for that. But if you're not looking at all three of those dimensions, and saying, what's a company's footprint physically and in ESG land more broadly? How does that impact their long-term viability, profitability, investment opportunity, go on and on and on? And why is that a good or not a good investment? Like, then I don't think you're doing your job as an investor.
Well, how do you then measure the effectiveness of any ESG initiatives
No. Yeah.
in your portfolio? And, what benchmarks or metrics do you rely on to evaluate the impact of ESG on both financial performance and broader societal outcomes?
Yeah. But look, I think we want to hold these strategies accountable to the same, risk return kind of assessment that we would any other strategy. The more interesting part of the journey today is this: how do you measure the real world outcome of an ESG strategy? So what we've moved from over the past couple of years is this idea that I want to de-risk my portfolio and make it more carbon friendly as measured by greenhouse gas emissions or some other metric, to something that is really more, how do I prove that the real world outcome of this portfolio is bending that trajectory? And it's a very important distinction because, and we've done some pieces on this, like the easiest way to decarbonize your portfolio is to exclude companies, like take them out of the portfolio, right? You can immediately have a carbon reduction if you take energy companies out of the portfolio, for example, but you've done nothing to actually change the real world outcome. So I think increasingly investors are trying to figure out, like, how would they actually bend the curve on the real world outcome? And I think that's a kind of emerging. I'll say, in Europe, there's obviously a lot of energy and a lot more thinking about that, but it's kind of still an emerging topic, and precisely what metrics to use is not clear all the time.
Let me turn away from ESG. I know you have a lot more to say on that. We have limited time.
Yeah.
How do you balance the need for short-term performance with institutional investors' long-term objectives, particularly during market turbulence?
Yeah, no, look, I think this is always the conundrum, right? And we've seen this, probably throughout our careers many times. When you get market drawdowns, everybody says, yeah, I'm going to buy the dips. But when the dips actually happen, I'm running for the hills, right? So I think there are a couple of things. One is try to keep it, everybody anchored on the long term. We put in place a financial plan. We put in place an asset allocation strategy, a strategic allocation. So, this is within those parameters. And yes, it feels pretty painful in this moment, but let's go back to first principles. We're investing over a longer term horizon, and we're still on track based on what we're seeing in the numbers. So kind of coming back to those fundamentals is really, really important. I think you do still have to demonstrate to clients that that thing is going to mean revert, or that thing is going to do better in the future. So especially if you're in an active strategy and it's underperformed what the benchmark even did during a drawdown phase, you probably have a little extra work to do, because you have to be able to prove out the value prop of that thing recovering and doing better in the future. But make no mistake, I mean, one of the biggest changes from when I first was in this business is everybody is an expert on what's going on in the market, because they tune into social media, they tune into the television, they read the papers, they are fascinated by the conversation. So, you need to work even harder, I think, to help people stay grounded and not react to what's happening in that moment.
I mean, let's turn to one specific asset class, emerging markets. What's your view of the opportunities in emerging markets, and what specific factors do you consider when determining your exposure to these markets in a diversified portfolio?
Yeah, look, I mean, emerging markets have a lot of positives, right? And first of all, I should say that one of the biggest challenges is that emerging markets are not homogenous. In fact, they're quite heterogeneous. There are some emerging markets that are very, very, very large, like China and India. And then there are others that are quite small. There are some that are growing. There are some that aren't growing as fast as they once were. There are some that benefit from demographic or natural resources and gifts, and there are some that don't. So I think one of the first things that we've been spending a lot of time from a research and a client standpoint is decomposing the emerging markets a bit. So it's not just one big amorphous mass, but you can actually look at kind of clusters, if you will, and deploy your capital into parts of the emerging world that look to be more well-positioned for future growth. So that's the first thing I'd say. But make no mistake, there's a lot of opportunity there. And from a business standpoint, we're also seeing a lot of growth in certain geographies around the world, primarily in what we would characterize today as the emerging world. So I think it's also your own experiences with seeing how business is evolving, how wealth is being created, how technology is being innovated and deployed. So there's a lot of goodness there. But make no mistake, we still see that here in the United States, for the moment at least, a lot of the primary innovation is still taking root, and the innovation engine is still much more anchored, if you will, in U.S. So right size it. Well, first of all, I guess don't think of it as a homogenous mass. It's very heterogeneous. Kind of pick your spots. Secondly, pick your allocation amount, right? So this is a place where you do have heightened volatility. We do think that over time, the dollar should have a secular weakening, and that would actually be flattering to many of these emerging economies where the dollar translation could actually be good from a U.S. investor standpoint. So that's another potential benefit here. And then thirdly, the asset class that we've been kind of most excited about is actually emerging markets bonds, because they're, again, in an environment where rates may be coming down again. The opportunity for incremental income in countries who have debt securities that are actually, pretty attractive from a risk-return standpoint is something increasingly we're encouraging our investors to consider.
What role does data analytics play in your decision-making processes, and how is State Street utilizing data to drive business outcomes?
Yeah, well, it's part and parcel. We use data and analysis literally across everything that we do. So you might think something as basic as indexing doesn't require a lot of data and analysis, but let me tell you, it requires actually a lot of data analysis and tools, because you not only need to have all the different securities and benchmarks and corporate actions and dividend payments, and just think about all the different things that go into intelligently managing that portfolio. And then, oh, by the way, you need to be able to trade it, rebalance it, manage flows. It's just a massive amount of data that you have to assimilate to be able to make sure that you're investing in a wise and low tracking risk manner. And then certain exposures like EM debt, which we just talked about, they require even more data analysis, because sometimes you can't possibly buy all the securities in the index and fixed income. And so being intelligent about how you go about that portfolio construction and optimization is absolutely critical. And then obviously when you get to the active side, you put that on steroids, right? Because now you've got to have models and you've got to have data sets that drive those models. You go to the ESG sustainability world, and now all of a sudden you need a bunch of other data, because now you're trying to navigate real world outcomes in ESG or primarily E and S kind of factors. So it's our day, managing all that and making sure that we have state-of-the-art access, and that we also are creating our own proprietary data sets where that's appropriate.
Yeah. Now, how is integrating, let's say, artificial intelligence and machine learning, fields within data science impacted State Street's operations and strategic initiatives?
Yeah. So I would say that there are some sort of use cases today that don't sound very fancy, but they're actually really important. So if you look at on the operations side at State Street Bank, there have been a number of tools deployed to help with things like settlements and failed trades and things of that nature. And that's not the kind of, generative AI, let's kind of go crazy type of a tool, but they're tools that actually are incredible productivity enhancement and risk mitigant kinds of tools. So I would say there's a very strong legacy of integrating some of those kinds of technologies to basically run the business. And then within our analytical teams, within our investment research teams, again, there are a variety of tools that, transpire into factors or other kinds of signals that give us intelligence about the world or intelligence about the investment consideration set. And then we use, these tools like, natural language processing or other things that help us to be smarter in our investment decision making. The kind of emerging area that is really promising is almost like this co-pilot research assistant area. So we're doing lots of speccing on what kind of tools could we use that would short circuit a lot of the hard work that the teams do today to gather data, read papers, build models. A lot of that can actually be done by a pretty smart, co-pilot or research assistant. Would have been done and does get done today by people, but a lot of that could be done by some of these tools that are emerging. But I think the common thread across all of these platforms is it's not about man versus machine or woman versus machine. It's about them working together, that these are shortcuts that let you spend your human insight and energy on things that actually matter, where you actually do have intuition that you want to test, that you do have thesis that you want to test, that you are discriminating between what's just sort of a correlation versus what's really causal and what you should be making decisions based on. So we're treading light to medium, I would say, with the idea that over time this will probably accelerate pretty rapidly, but through the lens that it's not a replacement, it's an augmentation, and that the combination of our research analysts and portfolio managers with these tools is world-beating.
Yeah, I agree. It just augments the time that they have to spend. If you have a limited amount of time in active management to analyze all the companies throughout the world where you might want to invest using that natural language processing and machine learning, you could cover that fairly quickly and then use it as a screening process. I mean, right now, even quantitative models, all they use for screening is, they have certain characteristics and or factors, and they screen on that basis. This is much more complementary. What are your biggest challenges in managing technology and innovation at State Street?
Well, there are many, but I don't think we're unique. So I guess first is it's a very large, complex organization already, and we have literally dozens of different, third-party vended technologies that we use on a daily basis, and they have up and downstream implications, right? Everything from, when you source data, where does the data go? And it might have to go to more than one place because you've got different tools serving different needs. And then, by the way, we need to get that served up to the portfolio manager and augmented with other information like cash flows. And then we need reporting and trading, and you get the joke, right? There's just an incredible ecosystem that goes around the business. And by the way, in many cases, there are very idiosyncratic tools that you need to use. So if you think about managing a private equity portfolio or a senior loan portfolio, sometimes you need very specialized kinds of tools that sit alongside the industrial strength ones to be able to manage bits and pieces of the portfolio. And so that all has to be integrated. So I guess the first thing I would say is that you have to just recognize it is a complex ecosystem by nature. And anything you do in one part of that ecosystem, you need to be really sure that you've thought through the downstream and upstream implications of that. So that's number one. So the first question I always ask when I get a proposal to buy a new tool or install a new tool is, okay, so have we done, true scoping? Have we really looked at not just let's plug this thing in, but what else has to be done to make sure that's successful and that it's not introducing other risks? The other thing that's really important is, the whole kind of regulatory environment we all operate in. right? So, we talked just a little bit about, AI. I mean, there's just a lot of work that still needs to be done on how do you govern these tools? How do you, use them for decision making and be able to evidence that there's embedded risk management and governance process in these kinds of tools. You need to be able to test them. You need to be able to, over time, validate efficacy. So there's a whole kind of, I'll call it regulatory, but it's more than that. But it's this kind of governance around technology that I think a lot of organizations perhaps don't do what they need to do to navigate that. I mean, we obviously work with a lot of third-party managers, and when we do due diligence, sometimes it surprises them the kinds of questions we're asking because they perhaps haven't thought about some of these things in the way that we need them to think about them. So that's another big piece of it. And then I think the third is just resourcing because it's insatiable. I have teams every day come to me with a request for more data, more data, more data. Like we're at the type of an industry where you can just have an insatiable appetite because there's so much interesting stuff out there. So figuring out the right ways to prioritize, justify, if you will, and really pressure test, like what is the true value of that technology project, that data, pick whatever bit you're talking about. Like, how do you pressure test that early so that you are making good choices in an environment where, by definition, there's only a certain amount of resource to go around?
Last question, and I'm sure this will be of interest to viewers who are interested in breaking into this area. And by the way, let me repeat, I'm very impressed with the fact that you went to Princeton, got a degree in religion, and then went on to achieve the success you have as a CIO. I'm sure along the way, Carnegie Mellon helped a little bit.
Yes, indeed. And the CFA, I had a very senior investment professional who interviewed me for one of my jobs, who was pretty cold throughout the entire interview. And then at some point, I said that I was a CFA Charterholder, and his eyes lit up. And he said, "It's not on your resume." And I was like, "But I am." And all of a sudden, the tone of the interview changed, and I think I might have gotten that job all because I was a CFA Charterholder.
Well, I do recommend to students who are trying to switch into the area. In fact, I just wrote this morning to someone who was had an interest in moving from the back office to the front office, and I mentioned to him that he should take the CFA exam. I mean, it's an incredibly rigorous exam, and a lot of portfolio managers, when they're looking to hire, look for someone who has that interest.
Yep.
In general, when you're looking to hire someone, okay, a newbie, a new person who's in the industry, what do you look for? And what advice would you give someone who came up to you and said, "I would like to break into the industry. I'm starting college. What should I do?"
Yeah. Well, first of all, I would say this is a fantastic industry because honestly, the numbers suggest that finance is not the preferred career path for a lot of graduates. They want to go into technology, entrepreneurialism, consulting. So the first thing I would say is fantastic because finance needs the greatest minds that we can possibly get. And it is a career where you can have incredible impact on so many things, people's financial security, for example. So that would be the first thing I would say. The second thing that I look for when I'm talking to young candidates is, are they intellectually curious? And are they intellectually curious about investment problems? Because this is the kind of environment where your output will only be as good as your input, and your input will only be as good as your mind will let it be, right? You have to have intellectual curiosity, be kind of drawn to solving these kinds of problems. Don't just accept information on face. Ask why. Ask what if. And oh, by the way, it's an industry that's evolving very, very quickly. So for those who are intellectually curious and are capitalizing on the emergence of some of these new technologies or these new modalities, they're going to accelerate their career because change is happening very rapidly in our business. And then I think the last piece I would say, and this is the one where a lot of people fall down, sweat the details. I'm in a business where you need to be precise all the time. And it's great to think the big thoughts, right? And be intellectually curious. But if you're not also willing to put in the hard work to sweat the details, I mean, one of the first jobs that I had when I came out of college was I was building models for these financings that we were doing in our municipal finance division. And that was back in the days of Lotus 123. So it was a few years ago. But I was the person who could literally read these prospectuses and translate that into, a dashboard. And I had to make sure that I was painstaking and moving things from one thing to, one place to the other. And then the other thing that I had to do, first career was literally go through the pitch decks and flip page by page every copy of the pitch book and make sure that no pages got sideways on the copy machine. I mean, talk about a painstaking process. But, it taught me a lesson about how important the details are.
Now, well, Lori, you and State Street must be doing a wonderful job. Every encounter I had with someone on your portfolio management team, including the research groups, has, fit the description of what you stated. So with that, I have no further questions. If you want to make any comments, that's fine. Other than that, we'll conclude.
And now, again, just thank you so much for hosting me today. Hopefully, I've been able to share some ideas that people can take away and it helps them in their career journey.
Well, you have it. Thank you.